Welcome to Bible study. We are looking at 2 Kings chapter 5, and a very familiar story for many of us. It is the story of Elisha healing the Syrian captain, or the Syrian general by the name of Naaman. If you have got your Bibles handy, please grab that. Turn to 2 Kings chapter 5. We can tell the story, but it's good for you to be able to read along just a little bit. Let's do that. Let's look at it. Leading up to this, we've been doing a little compare and contrast with Elisha and his predecessor, Elijah. And if you remember, Elijah was sort of the prophet who stood on the outside and railed at all of the evil that was going on in the world. He had a lot of things to say, and he would sometimes call down the fire of God upon it. But Elisha, we've noticed, has been working inside. Where Elijah tended to break things, Elisha tends to heal things. And he works inside the structures, inside the economics, inside the social structures, inside the things that are going on, inside the people of God. And not that one is better than the other, nor that one is more or less effective than the other. I think one of the reasons that the Deuteronomic history poses these two prophets and highlights them to the extent that it does is because it really wants to say something to us about the way that we expect God to work. I think sometimes we have a propensity to over-expect Elijah. But maybe we need to have our eyes a little more open to the workings of the Elisha model. The model in which God works inside things that are already there. You'll see behind me there's a picture of Jesus. It's a famous one. Jesus and the two Emmaus disciples walking along. And that's a very interesting story to have behind this, because the two disciples are in grief because of Jesus' death on the cross. They're walking to a nearby town, and all of a sudden Jesus shows up inside the conversation. And he talks with them, but they don't recognize him. It is only after he's had a long conversation with them, as it says, as he has opened up the scriptures, the Old Testament, the Psalms, the prophets, even the stories of Elijah and Elisha to them, in which he has said, don't you see it was necessary that the Son of Man, that the Messiah, suffer and be betrayed and die and rise again? It's only after he's brought them to that point, and they still don't recognize him. But they say, why don't you stay with us, for it is evening and the day is long over. They offer hospitality to him. And while they're sitting down to eat a bite of food, he breaks the bread, and it's like all of a sudden their eyes are opened to see Jesus, who has been there all along. I think sometimes that's really hard for us, to see the Elisha kind of God. Because we kind of like the God who comes in the spectacular and sort of the Hollywood blockbuster method of solving problems, which usually is to blow a few things up. Send in Superman or one of the other superheroes. But Jesus oftentimes is working very subtly and inside the world that we live in. I think for anybody who has worked in any kind of a caring industry, all right, teaching, nursing, medicine of any kind, but all kinds of social work, any kind of an entity where you're helping people, even something, a grocery checker, somebody who helps you at a store. I think we need to be at least open to the idea that when we encounter those people who are maybe not doing something out of the ordinary, that they're actually maybe being the presence of God to us. I'm not saying it happens every time. That's what makes them normal. But I think that Jesus may be showing up in our lives in the very simple and the normal things. Might be a pretty good takeaway from this. So turn to 2 Kings chapter 5. There we get a story. And it is in many respects, it starts off as a very difficult story for our time. Naaman, the commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great man, with his master in high favor, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. Notice, the Lord had given victory to Syria through Naaman. Already for the reader who is in exile, that's a bit of a slap in the face, that's a bit of a punch. The Lord gave victory to Syria? Yes. That's really important for them because the Lord also gave victory to Babylon. And much of the prophetic and Deuteronomic history, the prophetic witness and the Deuteronomic history witness are really designed to help the Israelites see. And there was a reason for that. And it was for our rebellion and our failures to follow God. That this is why God used other people, including Babylonians and Assyrians, to correct us. He was a mighty man of valor, but he was a leper. Now, that word in the Old Testament can mean a wide variety of things. We don't know exactly whether it is the affliction also called Hansen's disease today, that we typically, in a narrow sense, refer to as leprosy. But it could well have been. And the problem with it was, because they couldn't always accurately diagnose, they tended to make everybody live together who had any of the symptoms. And so, even if you only had something else, you were forced to live with the people who maybe did have leprosy. Probably didn't happen to Naaman. Now the Syrians, on one of their raids, had carried off a little girl from the land of Israel. And she worked in the service of Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "Would that my Lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria. He could cure him of his leprosy." This little girl introduces now the second very difficult part of this, because she was a captive in a wartime raid. It sounds okay until you really start to think about it. She had probably watched her father, older siblings, her mother perhaps be killed, tortured, hauled off, sold into slavery, separated from them. Today we would certainly call this little girl a victim. We would probably imagine she's been traumatized. And yet, in many respects, she's the hero of this story. She looks a lot like those people in exile. What has happened to them in a microcosm of her own family and her own little experience as a young person has happened to her, just as it happened to the whole nation. And it's interesting that she turns around and says, "I want to help the person who hurt me." Where does she get that? Everything we should expect would say she should hate Naaman and should be rejoicing over his demise from leprosy, a horrible way to die. But she doesn't. So Naaman went in and told his Lord, "Thus and so spoke the girl from Israel." And the king of Syria said, "Go, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel." So he went, and he took with him 10 talents of silver. This is a lot of money. I mean, a lot of money. 6,000 shekels of gold. 10 changes of clothes. By the way, because of the way clothes was so valuable at the time, that may have been as much as the money. And he brought a letter to the king of Israel, which read, "When this letter reaches you, know that I have sent you Naaman my servant, that you may cure him of his leprosy." And when the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and he said, "Am I God? How can I cure a man of leprosy? Do you see what a fight this man is picking with me?" But then Elisha the prophet heard that he had torn his clothes, and he said, "Why did you tear your clothes? Send them to me. Then you will know there is a prophet in Israel." So Naaman came with his horses and his chariots and his servants. Notice, horses and chariots of Israel. These are the horses and chariots of Syria. He shows up with all of this retinue, these people. Because if you have 10,000 or 6,000 shekels of gold and 10 talents of silver and all of this stuff with you, you're not just traveling by yourself. You have a lot of people with you. And Elisha, when he gets there, sends a messenger to him and says, "Go, take a bath 7 times in the Jordan River. You'll be fine." Now, we know how this works because Elisha has been doing these bizarre, mundane things already. Give me a new bowl with some salt in it, and he cures the well, or solves or just start pouring oil out of your jug, and you'll have enough to sell. We're used to Elisha using everyday kinds of things to solve problems with the power of God. But Naaman, he's not. And so we know something he doesn't see. So Naaman says, "Wait a minute. I thought he'd surely come down and wave his hand over it, or do something dramatic anyway to cure my leprosy. Don't we have better rivers in Damascus? Abana and Pharpar? Couldn't I wash there and get clean?" And he storms off. But his servants, and this is another very interesting point, the servants are the smart ones in this story, and the servants are the helpers in this story. For the people who are in exile, they've been enslaved. They're all servants now. The servants of Naaman say, "Did he really ask you to do something so difficult? Didn't he just say, go take a bath? Why don't you try it?" And to his credit, Naaman doesn't get angry when his servants ask this of him. But rather he goes down and he does the 7-fold bath that Elisha had prescribed. And his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child. The leprosy, the rot, was gone. He returns to the man of God, he and all his company. He came and stood before him and said, "Behold, I know there's no God in all the earth but in Israel. And so accept now a present from your servant." But Elisha says, "As the Lord lives, I'm not taking anything. This is not for sale." He urged him, but he refused. Naaman said, "If you'll not let me have 2 mule loads of earth, for from now on your servant will not offer a burnt offering or sacrifice to any god but the Lord." 2 mule loads of earth. Well, in the ancient world, they really thought gods were associated with a place. This is really, Naaman's got a conventional understanding of God. And so if he brings a little of the place with him, God goes with him. By the way, this isn't as odd as you might think, or as alien to us as you might think. If you ever go to Jerusalem, there's a church, and it's okay. It's not a great site to visit, except for this fact: it's called the Holy Cross in Jerusalem. And what the mother of Constantine did was bring a whole bunch of dirt from Jerusalem and lay it out and build a church on top of it. with the idea somehow that this would make it a more sacred site. People have been doing this kind of stuff for a long time. He wants to be a worshiper of the Lord. But then he asks for this little, I don't know, how would we say? A break. In this matter, may the Lord pardon your servant when my master goes into the house of Rimmon to worship there, leaning on my arm, and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon. And when I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, may the Lord pardon your servant in this matter. In other words, I'm like general of the army. I have to go to these official functions, and they involve worshiping these other gods. What do I do? I love Elisha's answers. Yeah, go in peace. Don't worry about it. Just blowing the mind of maybe pious Lutherans, but also of poor Babylonian exiles. That somebody might be able to worship the gods of our enemies and be a worshiper of the Lord. Does it at least pry open that space a little bit for them to imagine that there could even be people who are listening to the Lord among those people going to that other church? Herb Hofer, if you remember him from his ministry in India, often asked this question because there were many people who went into the Hindu temples and put a picture of Jesus up there and prayed only to him. And he forced us to ask this question: are they Christian? It's kind of still an open debate because they don't get baptized. Are they a Christian? This text is making those kinds of questions more complicated. And it's making a people who are living in exile and a people living in the 20th century, it's making them face the reality that we may not have God as figured out as we like to think, and the boundaries that we like to draw around people and places and say they're out and we're in may not be as firmly or as sharply drawn as we think. That gets then drawn up by Gehazi, the man who was Elisha's servant, is overcome by his greed. He chases down Naaman later and says, wait, some people came and we need some clothes. Can you have a change of clothing for them? And he says, yes, take this, and here, take a bunch of money too. Gehazi brings it back and he stores it, buries it before they get home. But he shows up and Elisha says, do you think I really wasn't there when you asked him? Is this a time for taking money and giving and getting paid for stuff? No, it's not. The leprosy which we have taken from Naaman is coming to you. And Gehazi leaves his presence leprous. Sometimes it isn't whether you are a son of Abraham or not, but it is where your heart is. And in fact, it's always that way. They had hoped, this story really just shatters all of the hard and fast lines and assumptions that I'm sure people in exile who thought of the Babylonian only as his enemy, and who thought of all of his fellow Israelites as only the good guys. This chapter will really take those things and twist and turn and shake and upset even our assumptions and sensibilities. I hope we have a chance to talk with you more about this. Shoot me an email if you want to ask anything about it. I look forward to seeing you on Sunday. God bless you. Bye-bye.